It's oil pump day for the 308. This is the stock oil pump, and I'm going to pull it apart and clean it at the very least. But I've also heard of some mods that you can do to these just to improve oil pressure for the 308. I don't know if it's a mod that's only useful if you are, building a competition engine and going to run it really hard. And this engine will not be run hard. It's for auditory entertainment probably more than actual power. But I don't know, maybe it is worth doing the mods, and I'll find out a little bit more, and by the end of this video I will let you know what I decide. But the two mods are what I learned from Griff's rear mount turbo channel, and he talked about kind of port matching and deburring and radiusing all the oil galleries so that the oil just flows, I guess, uninhibited through the oil pump. And the second mod is in the, I'm not quite sure what it's called, but it's a spring that operates like a little piston almost, and I think that is like a pressure release. And you mod that so that the spring has a little bit more pressure and will therefore hold pressure, oil pressure higher to something like 70 or 75 psi. Anyway, I'm still learning, but my first steps are going to be the same no matter what, which is pull this thing apart and clean it up. I've seen inside these a few times, but I haven't ever pulled one apart before. So obviously when I was watching Griff's video, I saw the inside of it there. But also, and I can't remember whose channel it was, but they were just showing how you can pack these gears with Vaseline when you're putting it back together, which I understand just helps it prime easier and faster. So it's these galleries that I think get ported and radiused. That's actually not. That's not a sharp edge there at all. That's quite smooth over that one. There's a tiny little mark there, but not enough to feel with my fingernail. So hopefully this means there hasn't been too much junk go through the oil in this motor. There is a little part in here. That might be... Has that got something to do with the... I'm trying to remember what Griff said, something to do with the oil filter, and if it gets clogged for whatever reason, it's like a bypass valve. And that spring, a pressure release spring, is inside here, so I'm going to try my luck undoing that. That's a 1 inch. So this bung, I think the idea is to add more tension to this spring, you put, I think about 100 thou or 2.5 mil worth of something inside there, just so that it gives the spring less space to stretch out in, and therefore more tension on the spring. Apparently $1 coin is just the perfect thickness to grind down and put in there. I haven't decided what I'll do, or if I'll do that actually. Now, there is a little, like a piston or something inside there that spring pushes against. I do not know how to get that out though. I don't think I've ever seen a gasket try to become part of the thing that it was sealing. I'm quite so good as this. These super scrapers are brilliant because they're sharp, and they're not so great because they're sharp. So they'll get pretty much anything off, as long as you hold it really straight with the surface that you're working on. And that's kind of where the downside is, because they are so sharp and so strong that, or hard I should say, that you can easily scratch the surface that you're trying to clean. People also talk about high volume oil pumps, but I haven't read much that is in support of them for these 308s. The risk being that you end up getting too much oil flung up into the top end of the motor. I guess that can mean a bit of oil starvation, maybe around the crank and the rods. And maybe too much oil up in those valve covers just makes too much of a mess. Maybe it leaks. I'm curious to get that little piston out of there. Here it comes. There we go. So the spring operates in there. We pack out this bung so that by the time the bung's tightened up in there, there's more pressure on the spring, and therefore the release happens at a higher PSI. I wonder what the stock or the default PSI is for when that releases. More questions for research. In the old workshop manual that I have for the Holden HQ, and that's because this 308 is a red motor, pre-pollution, and therefore it's not in my HZ manual, there are specifications for a few of the working parts of the oil pump. Now the first is for the length of the regulator valve spring. Its free length is supposed to be 3¼ inches, which is 82.55 millimetres, and not the 76.37 millimetres that the manual says. It must be a typo. Mine is a little bit longer than that at 83.4 millimetres. Now, it doesn't look stretched. The coils are still very consistent, but at least it's not shorter, so I'm going to reuse it. Next is the specification for the drive gear, which has to be between 2.715 and 2.725 inches, or 68.96 and 69.22 millimetres. And that's from the end of the round part of the shaft down to the outer face of the gear. Now mine is 67.84 millimetres, no doubt. That's because the face of the gears against the oil pump cover has worn down over time. Then there's the gear backlash, which should be between 9 and 15 thousandths of an inch, but it was definitely less than the 9 thou feeler gauge. So I am not sure what's gone on there, but the pump worked before, so I'm trusting that that tighter fit of the gears is going to be just fine. Again, it's better than having too much backlash, I guess. There is one more specification for the face of the gears relative to the face of the pump body. But first, notice that I marked the gears with Sharpie dots, and that is so I know to put them back in with the same teeth orientation or meshing. I'm not sure that that matters, but when metal surfaces wear together, I reckon it's probably better to keep them together. So this final specification is that there needs to be a minimum gap of 3½ thousandths of an inch between a straight edge laid across the gears and the pump body itself. I imagine that's so that the gears sit a little bit proud of the oil pump body to account for the gasket, and so that they can sit as close as possible to the pump cover. My gap was about 3 thou, which isn't surprising as the face of the gears would have worn down over the life of the oil pump so far. Now, I could not find new gears anywhere, and I just didn't feel like I needed to buy a whole new oil pump. So I decided to instead just resurface the pump body about half a thou to bring it back into that spec. I had a marble chopping board that I never used, and the straight edge proved that it was really surprisingly quite level. So I got some 240 grit sandpaper and I taped it down onto the board. Then, very iteratively, I worked the face of the pump body with lots of measurements along the way. And I measured it at lots of different points around the surface of the pump body just to be sure that there was a minimum gap of 3.5 thou. And finally, I got it back in spec. So next I stripped off the old paint and a tiny little bit of surface rust. I used the drill with a bigger wire wheel just to get the bulk of it off, the more kind of accessible parts of the pump. Then the Dremel to get into the tight spaces with little wire wheels and cones. I cleaned all the parts in the parts washer. I had some oil gallery cleaning brushes and they helped to get into all the galleries in the pump. Then I rinsed off the parts and I dried them off. Now, I didn't seem to record it on video, but I did use that hairdryer to make sure that all the moisture was gone from every part of the pump inside and out. Finally, all the moving bits got soaked in engine oil before I started the assembly. Then for the Vaseline, I just packed in as much as I could around the gears and kind of massaged the gears and turned them a little bit just so I could keep pushing it in. To reassemble the oil pump, I squirted more engine oil in the galleries and on all the internal surfaces, and finally the gasket, and together it went. Now, I'm not going to paint this until it's attached to the block, so I did spray it down with some Lano Shield to just help keep flash rusting at bay, and it's done. I did get a new cam gear for it from Crow Cams, which recommended an appropriate one for the cam that I got for this 308. But I'm reusing the pin because, as with the regulator spring and gears, I just couldn't find any parts for this oil pump. And you would have noticed I didn't do any of Griff's modifications to improve oil pressure. Time was one reason, and another is that it probably doesn't need it because this 308 is not going to be worked hard. And hopefully this was useful for at least one of you, and I hope to see you back on the channel here soon.